Hello everyone, my name's Trisha. I just wanted to introduce myself briefly. Today I'm going to be talking briefly about social media and how it relates to science. So we all know that the internet has revolutionized our world. Social media in particular has completely changed the way that we connect with one another on a day-to-day basis. And I think it's important as a species to take a step back from this and examine our behavior as a species as we use this new medium of communication. But, of course, when taking a step back, it's hard not to notice the sheer narcissism of it all. Selfies to self-promotion, social media appears to be the perfect outlet for the narcissist. So if we're all using social media, what does this say about us as a species? So I try to find some studies examining this relationship. There have been relatively few studies on the relationship between social media and human behavior, and the studies that have been published have shown varied results. However, I did find one study that was published in December of 2014 in the Journal of Research on Personality, and it's entitled Narcissistic Power Poster, on the relationship between narcissism and status updating on Facebook. So with this study, obviously I want to examine human behavior as it relates to social media, but more importantly, I want to talk about how it relates to the philosophical concepts that we've discussed in this semester so far. So I'm basically going to talk about three different things. I'm going to talk about the actual hypothesis from the study, and secondly, I'm going to talk about the methods and data from the experiment, and lastly, I'm going to talk about the possible confirmation or disconfirmation of the hypothesis, as well as any potential problems that go along with this. So let's move on to the hypothesis. The hypothesis of this study is relatively simple. The authors of the experiment hypothesized that there is a direct correlation between a high number of status updates on Facebook and a high level of narcissism. So let's break this down. Let's call a high number of status updates on Facebook A and a high level of narcissism B. If the hypothesis is indeed correct, then A should equal B. This hypothesis is a how explanation because it's telling us how Facebook can supply us information about human behavior. And obviously, the prediction that ties in with this hypothesis is closely related. The authors of the experiment predicted to see a correlation between social media activity and narcissism. So if this hypothesis is indeed accurate, then we should expect to see a spike in the diagnosis of narcissism in the world. Since many people are using Facebook and they're using it in the way that this study predicts, the status updates should indicate a rise of narcissism within our society. So now I want to move on to the actual experiment. In order to test their hypothesis, the authors of the experiment selected a group of people from both the United States and Germany. Participants in this group filled out the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, which is a standardized test used to measure narcissism within a personality. Participants were also asked to provide up to 6 email addresses of family and friends, and these family and friends were then invited to complete an online questionnaire about the participant in question. And finally, the participants were asked to log onto Facebook and grant the authors access to the wall of their profile. The authors then counted all the status updates that they had posted within 6 weeks prior to ending the study. So they counted every single one. So now let's move on to the actual data. The data gathered for this hypothesis was quantitative in nature because the scientists were counting the status updates and comparing them to an empirical score on the Narcissistic Personality Inventory test. And in actuality, the data showed that there is no substantial relationship between narcissism and status updating activity on Facebook. So because the data did not support the hypothesis that a high number of status updates correlates to narcissism, the data disconfirmed the hypothesis. But I just want to clarify that the hypothesis was disconfirmed inductively. So yes, the data did not support the hypothesis, but there's still a possibility that the results of the experiment are wrong and the original conclusion is correct. The disconfirmation is inductive because we cannot absolutely be sure that a high number of status updates affects narcissism. All we can be sure of is that the evidence collected for this experiment does not support the original hypothesis, so therefore the disconfirmation is inductive. And of course there's inherent problems that come along with disconfirmation, and we've talked about these in class, and they relate to the Quine-Duhem thesis. And the first problem I want to talk about, it relates to the tribunal web of beliefs. So the main hypothesis in this study was disconfirmed. However, there are several auxiliary hypotheses that also must be disconfirmed along with it. Now, these might include hypotheses like the participants taking the MPI test answered truthfully, or the MPI test is not an accurate measure of narcissism, or maybe participants use Facebook differently than they would if they weren't being watched. So since we can blame the fact that the data did not support the hypothesis on these auxiliary hypotheses, disconfirmation is potentially a problem. So another problem I want to talk about is underdetermination. The hypothesis in the experiment is underdetermined by the evidence. So this means that the hypothesis did not support the hypothesis that a high number of status updates correlated with narcissism. So what is the data telling us? It could be a number of things. Maybe the status updates correlate with extroversion, or maybe they just mean that we're sociopathic. We don't know for sure. In this way, the data is underdetermining the hypothesis. So today we talked about the nature of the hypothesis and the predictions of the study I selected. We talked about the methods and data and the ultimate result. Hopefully I was able to logically show disconfirmation and the aspects of the Quine-Duhem thesis in a logical manner, and I thank you guys for listening.